Joining me now are two health economists for a conversation on cost, on value, and transparency when it comes to drug pricing. Antonio Ciaccia is the CEO of 46 Brooklyn Research. Sounds like a cool outfit I'm going to have to visit. A nonprofit organization working to improve the public's understanding of drug pricing data. And Kirsten Axelsen is a visiting research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Her work focuses on domestic and international pharmaceutical drug policy. She also consults with biopharmaceutical and other companies. Antonio and Kirsten, thank you so much for joining us. Antonio, let me just ask you this. You know, I've always been a fan of those old kind of Schoolhouse Rock shows, you know, how a bill becomes a law, and in the end, hey, I'm a law. But I figure I got to make a Schoolhouse Rock show on how a drug gets a price. You know, so what would be on your Schoolhouse Rock show on how a drug gets a price?
Well, I wish it would be one show, right? I think we'd be looking at various seasons of that show. Unfortunately, in the drug supply chain, we have a lot of different ways that we can actually quantify what price is. And that's where the opportunity for excess comes in, because unlike any other product that we purchase out in the open marketplace, a drug can have various prices that can exist at various stages in the drug channel. And when somebody is actually purchasing that product, their exposure to price could be different from the very next person that purchased it. And so because of that, you have a tremendous amount of opacity. And what I like to usually say is anytime you have more than one price, there's no such thing as price.
Fascinating. Well, I mean, I know, Kirsten, that Antonio has called America's pricing system the most dysfunctional pricing market in the world. What do you think?
I mean, the prices for drugs in the U.S. are similar to the prices for other types of healthcare in the U.S. There's a lot of opacity, and the prices for physician visits are, in many cases, controlled by the federal government. So I don't think just the federal price controls are going to solve a system that is very, very difficult to parse, as Antonio, I think, has correctly identified. You know, when a drug is launched, we have the worst, most incomplete data about it we'll ever have. Right? We have the clinical trial data, which comes from a very artificial, sanitized group of patients. We have never seen the federal government invest in making real-world evidence available. We really want to put the pharma companies back on their heels. We should have interconnected data where we can evaluate these drugs and see if they're doing what they say they can do in real-world settings, in different types of patients, in diverse populations. And to me, that would be a way you could really see whether these drugs are worth the prices that are being charged, whereas now we have very little information.
Well, I mean, I guess one of the areas of concern, because I have really spent a lot of time with people on I wouldn't even call it both sides of debate, because there seem to be multiple sides of the debate. But Antonio, you know, one of the things that I do think is compelling from the pharmaceutical industry side of this is that they do take a lot of risk. I mean, there's this great film, you know, where Lilly invests $1 billion in an Alzheimer's drug, and it didn't pass the trials. It funded their. I've often told pharmaceutical companies, why aren't you, rather than just marketing your successes, also marketing your failures, so that people understand, you know, the give and take. And I think the other dimension of it, you know, which I find interesting, is that there are a lot of other parts of the system that add price, not just what the drug company says. But so I'm wondering whether that framing I'm trying to bring to this, you know, is some defense of this. Not to say that we shouldn't have greater competition out there, which I believe we should, but aren't there misunderstandings as well about opportunity and risk in innovation and drug development?
Well, Steve, it appears that you're talking about the nuance of how drug pricing and drug incentives actually work, which unfortunately I think is lost upon, you know, a lot of those that set narratives around drug pricing reform. There's no question that you've got, you know, problems with drug pricing. There's no question that we have problems with transparency within the drug channel. But to your point, you know, yes, for every success, there could be, you know, multiple failures. And regardless of whether there's more successes than failures, what really matters is how we want our system of incentives designed. We want drug makers, we want those who invest in drug companies to have adequate incentive to continue to bring new innovative therapies to marketplace. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we hope that they're actually innovative. And then we hope that they bring about cures or bring about better forms of treatment that exist in the current marketplace today. But as we look at how to calibrate, how to fix our drug pricing problems, it feels as though we're just taking a very top-down approach, a very surface-level approach, without understanding that if we don't like what the system is currently yielding, then perhaps we need to change the incentives of what it's currently yielding. Is, how do payers, whether it's government, insurers, PBMs, you name it, if we don't like what we see, if we feel like we're getting poor value, then we need to calibrate the incentives that drug makers have in order to get essentially more of what we actually want.
Wow. Kirsten, on your side of this, you have an interesting role that I want to highlight, and I guess I want to thank you for it, because I think it sounds good. But you're Secretary of the Preparedness and Treatment Equity Coalition, which, if I take it at face value, is about equity and preparedness. So what are you trying to fix? What problems are you trying to fix out there, when it comes to this industry and the provision of health to patients?
Absolutely. I mean, me and my co-founder, Benson Shu, have both worked in healthcare for a very long time. He's on the provider side, and we see that behavior follows metrics and payment and reimbursement. There's been, an increasing focus on increasing equity in healthcare delivery. Our health outcomes should not depend on our race or ethnicity, but yet there's still, pervasive and widening gaps, which were only made more stark when we saw the impact of the pandemic, particularly on people who had underlying cardiovascular and metabolic conditions. So we're an organization funded by life sciences companies, and we fund research that is implementable, different ways to deliver and pay for healthcare and measure healthcare value that is specifically focused on increasing equity in healthcare delivery.
Well, fascinating. On the other side of this, I'm sort of interested, Antonio, on what you think are the levers, because again, this is a very, very opaque topic to many people. We would hear Donald Trump, talk about negotiating with, companies and getting prices down. I've heard that just from the Congressman Cardenas a minute ago, as part of the Build Back Better plan. What do you think are the realistic ways in which to get drug costs lower? What are the easiest, lowest hanging fruit in that struggle?
When I think of low-hanging fruit, I think of, a lot of the waste that lives within the drug channel itself. A lot of our research is concentrated on, what Medicaid programs pay for prescription drugs, what pharmacies are compensated for prescription drugs. What we find is there's a tremendous amount of waste from drug maker to wholesaler to pharmacy to PBM to plan sponsor. And, not to pick sides on it, because we certainly have a lot of issues on the drug maker side, but drug makers produce drugs to flow into a drug channel, which begs the question of what are the incentives that the drug channel provides those drug makers. We've done research, dating back to look at Prilosec and the conversion over to Nexium. Nexium is not necessarily a bad product, but its value add to the system was extremely small relative to the drugs that were already on the market for PPI. PBM signed up, government programs signed up saying, yeah, we want that drug, even though it was significantly more expensive than the drugs that were already on the marketplace. The message sent to the drug makers making those drugs is, give us more of them because we'll cover them, even if they don't provide significant value relative to what was already in the marketplace before them. So when I look at, what I'd like to see as far as, drug pricing reform, it is, making sure that if particular products provide little value relative to what's on the marketplace at the time, we need to make sure that a system doesn't provide that incentive to drug makers and instead focuses it more on more relevant treatments and therapies. And then moving down through the channel, making sure that arbitrage isn't being exploited by PBMs, pharmacies, wholesalers, et cetera, because to me, that's where a lot of the low-hanging fruit is available.
Thank you. Kirsten, I wonder if you could kind of give us a lesson, because as I've looked at it, and if I were to look at, pharma material, which I also read and look at, they show that in the aggregate, drug prices have just not, according to them, have not risen. That there is a kind of view out there about the overall costs of healthcare. Their argument is that people are feeling and sensing this more because of changes in the insurance industry and deductibles and that dimension. And I'd just love to hear where that is true. And then another side of this on the generic side has to do, as we were talking about, biosimilars and other, products, complex molecules and others coming onto the market, and how you get the transition from the sort of, intellectually property, protected innovation, and then moving after a certain number of years to something where that product, because it's in the health space, becomes available on mass basis by producers that are in the generic area. I'd like to know what the fault lines are in that, what has come undone, if anything, in that equation, and what is, from your perspective, fact and fiction when it comes to pricing?
The vast majority of the market is working well to deliver low-cost generics that are not in short supply. More than 90% of the drugs that are dispensed in this country are generic. And there are a few that get a lot of attention that are in short supply. You have big price increases. But overall, the system is working incredibly well. And in fact, drugs are the only part of the healthcare system that has a built-in cost savings. You don't see the cost of surgery declining after 12 years or 11 years on the market. So, and when we think about patient out-of-pocket costs, there are a small number of patients who have devastatingly high and unaffordable out-of-pocket costs, and their out-of-pocket costs need to be addressed. And that's an issue of both the price of the drug and the insurance benefit design. There's just more expensive drugs because we've seen more transformative therapies. On the other hand, if you look at adherence, even with generics, which are very low cost, sometimes less $0 or $5 for many cardiovascular drugs, the adherence is not that much better. Still, half of people drop off taking these drugs after 6 months. So we can't say that all the problems are because of the out-of-pocket costs. It needs to be addressed, but we have a larger issue in that we are wasting a tremendous amount of money and life by not finding better ways to get people to, understand the value of staying on these low-cost therapies and really identifying sort of the behavioral nudges that would help people adhere with the preventive care, which is widely available and fairly inexpensive.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I guess, Antonio, what I would like to ask just on the other side of this is when I talk to the generic side, and I kind of look at, what are the big drivers that you think would help bring costs down? They said, look, just let competition happen. So what are the inhibitors to competition that we ought to have on our dashboard?
Well, the generic manufacturers are right. We studied generic drug prices more than we should. And what we see is a very lean and mean marketplace where there are a lot of manufacturers who compete with one another to beat down the cost of those generic products. You have an incredibly functional and a highly competitive marketplace on the generic side. Then we turn over to the brand sector, and everything goes the exact opposite. Competition actually makes prices go higher and actually forces the list price even further and further from the real price through the rebating process. You have a really perverse system on the brand side where we would think competition would lower prices, what it actually ends up doing is oftentimes having the opposite effect. And look no further than insulin, where the net price that a manufacturer might take in for an insulin product might be 13% of what the actual list price is. And that's a symptom of a marketplace that encourages high list prices and high discounts rather than actually lowering the list prices as a means of competition.
Well, we're going to end it there. I think it's a fascinating conversation on topics that make my head spin with all the detail. But Antonio Ciaccia, CEO of 46 Brooklyn Research, and Kirsten Axelsen, Research Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.